So I'm going to go ahead and start out with a question for Dr. Rowan. Yesterday, you spoke about a sense of competition amongst breed associations, right? To figure out how are they going to be the ones to get that methane index or whatever it's going to be first. Is there any discussion on thinking about the vast landscapes we have across the U.S., more about optimizing genetics for the environment they're in? And working more collaboratively across those associations?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And breed associations are a unique beast that sit somewhere between a not-for-profit and have a very vested interest in furthering their breeders' ability to have a competitive advantage, because the breeders are selling the bulls at the very local level, like you said. So I think that sort of adaptation to environment and trying to make cattle that function well. Is that sort of what you're asking about? Yeah, I think there's certainly an interest there, and there's a lot of untapped potential, low-hanging fruit that we're still not doing across the industry at the level of the cow-calf operation. Frank showed a bunch of pictures of these beautiful baldy heifers and cows. And I leaned over to Tom, I'm like, man, isn't she beautiful? And he said, I love that heterosis. And that's one thing that I think, less than 50% of our herds are taking advantage of crossbreeding, which we know is just right off the top from a genetics perspective. 12% more weaning weight, that flows all the way through to the end product, but particularly for that cow that we're asking to go out and function. Lots of untapped abilities there that's going to take cooperation, of course, in breed associations, working with commercial producers that are purchasing these animals to make that crossbreeding happen. So there's a lot of opportunities there. There's always going to be competition, but it'll take some pressure from upstream, whether that's at the level of the consumer, the packer, the feed yard, that demands that from the seed stock producers. And our biggest challenge in the beef industry is always going to be those sort of unlinked. We saw all the way from cow-calf to retailer in that last presentation. In every link there's an opportunity to maintain value through the end, whether that's on methane or something else. We have to have an industry that's built to capture that and keep those animals linked from seed stock all the way to the meat counter.
Thanks, Troy. We'll move over to Jenna, thinking from the Canadian Roundtable perspective. One of the beauties of a roundtable, right, is to convene the entire supply chain and really talk through these sorts of issues and think about the practicality for producers. We talked a lot today about the total impacts coming from methane emissions from the live animal stage. How does CRSB kind of address that topic that we all know, as Dr. Mittlerner mentioned, that the elephant in the room is that it's coming from the animals, those emissions, the opportunity for reduction from the animals. How do you as a roundtable work with the entire supply chain to make it feel a bit more like we are all working on this together collaboratively and it's not just producers must fix the problem?
Yeah, I feel like our roundtable does a pretty good job at bringing everyone literally to the table. So we had our AGM in April, and we facilitated some discussions, having everyone in the entire supply chain at each table and really talking through those action items that I outlined. And we have some really good partners, and they really prioritize the on-farm part of it, and that it needs to be adoptable, it needs to be feasible. And I think there is a lot of understanding and there's a lot of support to the grassroots producers. And one thing that we did at CRSB, and this kind of helps with our business case and our members, doing the assessment that we did and receiving those emission numbers, we're able to provide that to our members so they could use that in their reporting and their Scope 3 reporting. And it gives them a good, a representative value that is actual Canadian beef production with granular data that goes into their supply chain emissions. So it's give and take both ways.
Thanks, Jenna. John, you mentioned a little bit that, show me the data, right? And I think we've talked a lot here about we need so much more research and data to even be able to really promote these things. What would be a way to incentivize producers from the feed yard sector on being willing to take a risk and maybe help support gathering that data for us. So maybe they take that risk and there's not the expected result, but how do we get more data? How do we collaborate more there?
That's a tough challenge because in 1 week I'll probably get 5 phone calls from companies saying, hey, can you take a look at our product, and we're going to give you a 2.5% improvement on performance. And if I added every product that was promised a 2.5% return, we'd be doubling our production in the next year. So producers have kind of gotten burned on this several times. And when you do a study at a feed yard to, especially a feed additive, those are very, very difficult studies to do. I mean, logistically, it really creates a lot of nightmares. And then you also have to look at what is the response? What's it going to, what are we targeting? What's a win, right? And from a methane production standpoint, a win may be completely different than what, it's contrary to what's in the feed yard. For example, the seaweed product, I think the data the data is great, but you get to a level, it starts reducing consumption of the animals. There was a slide that Dr. Mitloner showed up there where dry matter intake was held steady, and yet average daily gain went up, right? What happened if dry matter intake went down? What would happen to productivity? You always have to ask yourself, if we impact dry matter intake or if we impact this, what is the net result on performance? Those are the types of questions that you have to be able to answer if you go to a feed yard asking to do a study.
Thanks. All right, we'll pop over to Nicole and Tom maybe for both of you, thinking of more of that in an extensive system, knowing that there is not currently a great method for enteric-specific mitigation opportunities. What are some of the ways that you're working with producers and across supply chains to help improve productivity? What would be the key things that you can be doing now?
Yeah, I'll point, I think, to some of the things I mentioned in my slide of spurring action in the value chain, even though we might not have these highly effective solutions on hand currently. And while in my role at EDF, I'm working less at the producer level, we try and take a very farmer and producer-centric approach to our work. And so, looking at some of those opportunities on the advocacy side, and I think big picture, a lot of what we think about is what incentives are needed to support these uptake of these types of solutions, and that can include trying to advocate and help companies advocate for support through government programs like USDA Environmental Quality Incentives Program, Conservation Stewardship Program, to incorporate methane reducing solutions and opportunities into what they will cost share with producers as one type of financial incentive, but also looking at other potential incentives within value chains that will support this transition, and acknowledging what a lot of folks have said is that just managing for cost and just covering cost and then offering some compensation is not necessarily enough. And we also need to consider things like technical support and extension, like Troy spoke about earlier, as really key opportunities to create additional opportunities for support. And so I think we're going to need to continue to get creative, and I think we think a lot about that in our role at EDF is how do we support companies and enable companies to better support the folks in their value chains and taking up these solutions in a way that feels good for everybody and feels like we're all working towards the same goal in a way that is willing.
Well, you hear me okay? Yeah. So, when I get back to New Zealand, we're going to sit down with the team and we're going to go into the stud, and we've got genomic certainty on 250,000 ewes and on a couple thousand head of cattle, both sides. And we're going to figure out what the closest thing that everybody here has come up with. Someplace we'll be making some phone calls. What's the closest thing using Lee Leachman's data for the cattle, and then using our own data for probably sill scores, I would guess, for the dams, and we're going to high grade. We're going to get rid of the 10% to 20% worst offenders from a methane production standpoint without trying to crap everything else up, and go see what happens. And meanwhile, I'll wait for you guys to do your studies so I can read about what should have happened 3 years from now, and we'll be on to the next thing, I hope. I don't mean that, but we don't have time to wait. We're at war. We're at war. All right? I'm not asking for shortcuts. I'm not asking for shortcuts, but there's pragmatic stuff. And the things I've heard today, the thing that's practical and pragmatic is high grading at seed stock level on progeny. That's, I don't know whether it's a one-time pickup for sure. Let's go get it. It's right there. Thank you.
All right, well, with that, since we're over time, we'll go ahead and thank our panelists. They'll be here all day. So if you have more questions, follow up with them.